The first time I heard her say no, it was soft, almost apologetic. The second time she said it, there was a small tremble in her voice that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. And when I realized the two men standing on her porch were completely ignoring her, something inside me snapped in a way that still makes me smile years later. Because those two door-to-door salesmen thought they had found the perfect neighborhood to push around. A quiet street full of elderly homeowners who were too polite to slam doors in people's faces. What they didn't realize was that every single house on that street had someone watching out for them. And that someone was me. Before we dive into this story, think about something for a second. Have you ever watched someone take advantage of a kind person and felt that slow burn of anger building in your chest? That moment where you realize someone needs to step in because the person being targeted is too polite to push back. If you love stories where karma shows up right on time and people who push too far end up deeply regretting it, then make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and stick around. Because what happened to those salesmen that afternoon turned into one of the most satisfying moments our entire street ever experienced. This happened many years ago when my husband and I bought our first house together. It wasn't some glamorous dream home like you see on TV renovation shows. It was an older house on a quiet street where every building had been constructed sometime in the early 1950s. The homes were sturdy, simple, and full of history. Most of them still had the same original brickwork, the same little front porches, and the same tall trees planted decades earlier by the families who first moved in when the neighborhood was brand new. But the thing that made the street truly special wasn't the houses themselves, it was the people living in them. Almost every single neighbor on that block had been there for decades. Many of them had moved in when they were young couples starting their lives, raising children in those homes, watching their families grow up, and eventually watching those same children move away and start families of their own. By the time my husband and I arrived, the street had quietly transformed into something like a living memory lane. Nearly everyone there was a senior citizen. They had stories stretching back 40 or 50 years about the neighborhood. They remembered when the big oak tree on the corner was just a tiny sapling. They remembered block parties from the 70s, snowstorms from the 80s, and summer evenings when kids rode bicycles up and down the street until the streetlights came on. At first, my husband and I felt a little out of place. We were the youngest people on the entire block by at least 30 years. I remember worrying that maybe the neighbors would think we were noisy or careless or that we might disrupt the peaceful rhythm of the street. But it didn't take long for those worries to disappear. Within weeks of moving in, we realized something important about the people who lived there. They weren't just neighbors who happened to share a street. They were a quiet little community that had taken care of each other for years. And before long, they started including us in that circle too. It began with small things. One afternoon, I noticed that my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, was struggling to drag her garbage can down the driveway toward the curb. She was a tiny woman in her 80s with soft white hair and the sweetest smile you could imagine. The trash bin was almost bigger than she was. So naturally, I walked over, took the handle from her hands, and rolled it down to the curb for her. She looked so relieved that you would have thought I had just lifted a car off her driveway instead of moving a plastic bin. After that, it became routine. Every trash day, I'd roll her cans down when I took mine out, and later I'd bring them back up when the trucks had passed. It took maybe 2 minutes of my time, but to her it meant everything. Not long after that, Mr. Donnelly from 3 houses down asked my husband if he knew anything about porch lights, because his had stopped working. My husband grabbed a ladder, spent 10 minutes fixing a loose wire, and suddenly word seemed to spread down the block that the young couple could help with things. Soon we were clearing leaves from gutters before storms, helping replace light bulbs that required ladders, tightening loose railings, and occasionally moving heavy furniture when someone needed help rearranging a room. None of it ever felt like work. In fact, we genuinely enjoyed it. These people had spent their entire lives building that neighborhood, raising families there, keeping the street beautiful and peaceful for decades. Helping them with small things felt like the least we could do. Over time, something interesting happened that nobody officially announced, but everyone seemed to understand. My husband and I had quietly become the unofficial protectors of the street. If something unusual happened, someone called us. If a storm was coming and drains were clogging with leaves, we were the ones clearing them. If a strange car parked on the block for too long, people would casually mention it to us during afternoon conversations over the fence. We never asked for that role, but we accepted it naturally because we cared about those neighbors. They had welcomed us into their community, and protecting that community just felt right. Unfortunately, there was one problem that kept appearing again and again like a stubborn weed in a garden. Door-to-door salesmen, and I'm not talking about the friendly teenagers selling school fundraiser candy bars or Girl Scout cookies. Those kids were always welcome. No one ever complained about them. The problem was the professional salesmen who treated neighborhoods like hunting grounds. The type who drove through streets looking for houses owned by elderly residents because they assumed older people would be easier to pressure into buying things they didn't need. These men would show up selling everything imaginable: home security systems, roofing inspections, expensive water filters, magazine subscriptions, energy contracts, pest control packages. Sometimes they weren't even selling legitimate products. Sometimes they were just testing how easily someone could be pressured into handing over money. And unfortunately, our street looked like the perfect target from the outside. A quiet neighborhood with mostly senior homeowners who had lived there for decades. For a while, I tried to be patient. I would politely open the door, listen for about 5 seconds, then say something like, "No thank you, we're not interested." Most of the time, that should have been the end of the conversation. But a surprising number of these salesmen refused to accept that answer. They would keep talking as if they hadn't heard me at all, launching into longer speeches about limited-time offers and special neighborhood discounts. Some of them even tried the classic trick of putting their foot slightly in the doorway so you couldn't close it easily. That tactic alone was enough to make my patience start wearing thin. Eventually, I decided the easiest solution would be to remove any possible confusion before it even started. So I bought a simple sign and mounted it right next to my front doorbell. The message on it was extremely clear. 2 words printed in bold black letters: No Solicitors. You would think that would solve the problem. Any reasonable person would see that sign, shrug, and move on to the next house. But strangely enough, that sign seemed to have the opposite effect on some people. Instead of treating it like a warning, certain salesmen acted like it was a personal challenge, as if they were thinking, maybe that rule doesn't apply to me. And every time someone ignored that sign, I felt my patience getting thinner and thinner. Because it wasn't just about my house. Those men were walking past the same sign and then knocking on doors belonging to people in their 70s and 80s who were simply too polite to slam the door on someone's face. They would stand there listening politely while someone talked at them for 10 minutes, even if they had already said they weren't interested. And the more I noticed that pattern, the more protective I started feeling about the entire street. What those salesmen didn't understand was that our neighborhood might have looked quiet and gentle from the outside, but it also had someone paying attention to every single thing happening on that block. And eventually, one afternoon, 2 particularly arrogant salesmen decided to ignore every warning sign they could possibly ignore. They knocked on the wrong door, pushed the wrong person, and ended up triggering a chain of events that none of them saw coming, and that was the day they learned a lesson about the word no. That afternoon started like 100 other quiet afternoons on our street. The sun was warm but not overwhelming, the kind of early evening light that made everything look calm and slow. I was standing in my kitchen rinsing dishes while the window over the sink was open, letting in a light breeze that carried the sounds of the neighborhood with it. On our street, sound traveled easily because things were always so quiet. You could hear someone mowing a lawn 3 houses away or a dog barking at the mail truck at the corner. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost frozen in time, like the neighborhood had decided decades ago that it liked things exactly the way they were and refused to change. That was one of the reasons I loved living there. There was a rhythm to the street that rarely broke. In the mornings, a few neighbors would shuffle outside to collect newspapers. Around noon, someone might water their flowers. In the evenings, people sometimes sat on their porches watching the sky turn orange as the sun went down. It was simple and calm, and after years of living in louder, busier places, that calm felt like a luxury. But that calm also made one particular problem stand out like a loud noise in a quiet room: door-to-door salesmen. I had already dealt with plenty of them since moving there. Some were polite enough to leave when they saw the No Solicitors sign by my door. Others would ring the bell anyway and then pretend they somehow hadn't noticed the sign that was literally inches from their face. And those were the ones that irritated me the most, because ignoring a sign like that isn't an accident. It's a decision. It means someone looked directly at a clear request for privacy and thought, that rule doesn't apply to me. Every time it happened, I felt that familiar spark of irritation light up somewhere deep in my chest. Normally, I kept it under control. I would open the door, point to the sign, and say something like, "I think you missed that." Most people would mutter an awkward apology and walk away, but a few of them didn't. A few of them liked to argue. And unfortunately for them, I've never been the kind of person who backs down from an argument when someone is clearly in the wrong. So over time, I developed a reputation with the local sales crowd. I didn't know exactly how the rumor spread, but somehow word must have gotten around that the woman in the blue house on the corner was not someone you wanted to push. Didn't yell. I didn't threaten anyone. But if someone ignored my sign and tried to pressure me, I had no problem explaining, very clearly and in great detail, why what they were doing was disrespectful and inappropriate. Some people call that confrontational, call it educational, and apparently those lessons stuck with a few people because after a while fewer salesmen knocked on my door. Unfortunately, that didn't mean they stopped coming to the street. It just meant they started knocking on other doors belonging to people like Mrs. Patterson. Mrs. Patterson lived in the little house directly next to ours. She had been on that street since before most of the trees were fully grown. Her husband had passed away years earlier, but she still kept the house exactly the way they had always kept it. Small flower beds along the walkway, wind chimes hanging gently from the porch roof, and a rocking chair that faced the street. She was the kind of person who apologized when someone else bumped into her. If a stranger knocked on her door, she would open it with a polite smile every single time, even if she had absolutely no interest in whatever they were selling. That kindness made her wonderful, but it also made her an easy target for people who relied on politeness to keep conversations going longer than they should, which is exactly why I paid attention whenever someone unfamiliar walked onto our block, and that afternoon, I noticed them almost immediately. I had just finished drying the last plate and set it on the rack when movement outside the kitchen window caught my eye. 2 men were walking slowly down the sidewalk, dressed in identical polo shirts tucked into khaki pants. They each carried a small tablet and a stack of pamphlets tucked under one arm. You could spot salesmen like that from a mile away. They walked with that deliberate pace, scanning each house carefully like hunters studying a field. One of them was tall and thin with slicked-back dark hair and the kind of confident posture that suggested he was used to talking over people. The other one was shorter but stockier, with a wide grin that looked less friendly and more rehearsed. They paused at the first house on the block, knocked, waited. No answer. Then they moved to the next house, knocked again. That door opened briefly, and even from my kitchen window I could see the familiar body language. The homeowner, Mr. Donnelly, barely opened the door more than a few inches before shaking his head and closing it again. The salesman lingered for a few seconds like they might try knocking again, but eventually they turned and moved down the DT sidewalk. Then they reached my house. I watched them approach the porch, and I saw the exact moment their eyes landed on the sign next to my doorbell. No Solicitors. The tall one stopped walking. He leaned slightly toward the sign, read it, and then looked at his partner. The two of them exchanged a quick glance that said, "Everything without words." Then the tall one shrugged and rang the doorbell anyway. I felt my jaw tighten instantly. There's something uniquely irritating about watching someone deliberately ignore a clear boundary. It's like watching someone step over a fence with a sign that says "Do not enter" and then acting surprised when the owner gets upset. I walked to the door and opened it just enough to look directly at the sign before looking back at them. "Did you two happen to notice that?" I asked calmly, pointing to the words beside the doorbell. The shorter one glanced at it and chuckled like it was some kind of joke. "Oh yeah," he said casually. "We saw it." I blinked slowly. "You saw it?" "Yeah," he said again, still smiling. "And you rang the bell anyway." The tall one stepped forward slightly, holding out one of the pamphlets like he was presenting a prize. "We're actually offering a special neighborhood." I held up my hand and cut him off immediately. "No." Just one word. Clear, simple. The kind of answer that should end a conversation, but instead of nodding and leaving like any reasonable person would, the tall one tried to continue talking. "It'll only take a minute." I pointed directly at the sign again. "That sign means you don't ring the bell." The shorter one rolled his eyes like I was being unreasonable. "Ma'am, we're just trying to—" "No," I repeated, this time a little more firmly. For a moment there was silence on the porch. Then the tall one sighed dramatically, like, "I was the one making things difficult." "All right," he said, turning away slightly. "No need to get upset." Upset? That word made my irritation spike just a little higher. But I didn't argue. Instead, I simply stepped back and started closing the door. Before it shut completely, I said one last thing. "You might want to start reading signs. It'll save you a lot of time." Then the door clicked shut. From the living room window, I watched them walk down the driveway toward the sidewalk. But instead of leaving the street, they turned and headed directly toward the next house. Mrs. Patterson's house. The moment I saw them step onto her walkway, I felt a knot form in my stomach, because I already knew exactly how that interaction was going to go. She would open the door with a polite smile. They would start talking, and because she was too kind to interrupt people, they would keep talking. I moved back toward the kitchen window, which happened to be open just enough that voices carried clearly from the porch next door. And sure enough, a few seconds later, I heard the door open. Then Mrs. Patterson's gentle voice floated through the window. "Oh, hello there." One of the men launched into the same cheerful sales pitch they had tried on me. Something about inspections, something about neighborhood discounts. I heard Mrs. Patterson respond politely. "Oh, no thank you, dear, I'm not interested." A few seconds passed. Then the salesman kept talking. And a moment later, she said it again. Still polite, still gentle. "No thank you." But they didn't stop. And that was the exact moment the calm afternoon on our quiet street started turning into something else entirely. Because I was standing at the window listening to an 82-year-old woman say no for the second time, and those two men were pretending they hadn't heard it. And that was when I decided. This conversation was about to become my business. I stood by the kitchen window, completely still, listening. The afternoon sunlight was spilling across the counter, but the calm feeling from earlier was gone. In its place was a slow, rising tension in my chest. I could hear everything clearly through the open window next door. Mrs. Patterson's gentle voice floated over again. "No, thank you, dear. I'm not interested." That was the third time she had said it. 3 times. Any decent person would have understood by then. Any decent person would have smiled politely, said, "Have a nice day," and walked away. But these 2 men didn't move. Instead, one of them kept talking. His voice had that overly cheerful tone salesmen use when they're trying to bulldoze their way through a conversation. "Ma'am, I completely understand, but this will only take a minute. We're offering a special inspection for homes in this neighborhood and—" "I said no, thank you," Mrs. Patterson repeated softly. There was a small pause. And then, unbelievably, the other man jumped in with his own pitch. "Your neighbors are already signing up for this. It's really in your best interest to at least hear the details." That was it. Something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not explosively, just a quiet, solid moment of realization. They were ignoring her. They were counting on her politeness to keep her standing there while they talked over her. They were assuming she wouldn't raise her voice, wouldn't shut the door, wouldn't push back, and the more I thought about that, the more my irritation turned into something sharper. Because Mrs. Patterson had already said no, more than once, and where I come from, no means no. I leaned closer to the window and raised my voice just enough to carry across the small space between our houses. "She already said no." My words cut through the air like a sudden clap of thunder. Everything went silent for a moment. Then one of the men called back without even turning around. "We're fine, thanks." The casual dismissal in his voice made my jaw tighten. I pushed the window open a little wider. "No," I said firmly. "You're not fine." She said no. "That means you stop talking and leave." Now they turned around. Both of them looked toward my house with identical expressions of irritation. The tall one squinted at me like he couldn't believe I had inserted myself into the situation. "Ma'am," he called out, "this doesn't concern you." That sentence echoed in my head for a moment. "Doesn't concern you." I felt a slow smile spread across my face, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, it concerns me," I replied calmly. The shorter one folded his arms and shook his head like he was dealing with a particularly annoying child. "Why don't you just mind your own business?" That was the exact moment the situation changed. Up until then, I had been mildly irritated, maybe a little protective, but hearing that sentence flipped a switch in my brain. Mind your own business. I stepped away from the window, walked calmly through the living room, opened my front door, and stepped outside. The warm afternoon air hit my face as I crossed the small stretch of lawn between our houses. The salesmen were still standing on Mrs. Patterson's porch, clearly not expecting me to actually come out. Mrs. Patterson looked relieved the moment she saw me. "Oh, hello, dear," she said quietly, almost apologetically. I gave her a reassuring smile. "Hi, Mrs. Patterson." Then I turned my attention to the 2 men. Up close, they looked exactly the way pushy salesmen always look when someone interrupts their routine. Slightly annoyed, slightly defensive, like their carefully rehearsed script had suddenly been thrown. Off the tall one's side, "Look, ma'am, no," I interrupted. My voice was calm but firm. "You were told no." He spread his hands in an exaggerated gesture of patience. "We're just explaining." "You were told no," I repeated. My words landed heavier this time. The shorter one let out an annoyed laugh. "Lady, you seriously need to relax. Relax." That word might have worked on someone else, but not on me. I took a step closer and pointed directly at Mrs. Patterson's front door. She said no 3 times. Neither of them answered. "So here's how this works," I continued. my voice steady but sharp. "When someone says no, you stop talking and you leave." The tall one shook his head, clearly irritated now. "We weren't talking to you." "Congratulations," I replied. "Now you are." For a second, neither of them spoke. The tension on the porch was thick enough to feel. Finally, the tall one muttered something under his breath and turned toward the steps. "Whatever," he said. The two of them walked down the porch stairs and headed toward the sidewalk. For a brief moment, I thought that would be the end of it. But then the shorter one turned his head slightly as he passed me and said something that completely sealed their fate. "You should really learn to mind your own business." I stopped walking, slowly turned to face them, and that was when a new idea formed in my mind. A very simple idea. If they thought this street wasn't my business, then I was about to prove exactly how wrong they were. Because if they planned on knocking on every door on this block, then I planned on following them to every single one and making sure they heard the word no every time. The salesman had just started walking toward the next house, and I stepped off the sidewalk right behind them. They didn't know it yet. But their workday was about to become very, very long. The two salesmen stepped off Mrs. Patterson's walkway and headed toward the next house like the whole confrontation had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Their shoulders were stiff, their pace slightly faster now, the way people walk when they're annoyed but trying to pretend they aren't. I could already tell they thought the situation was over. In their minds, they had finished dealing with the annoying neighbor, and now they were free to continue working the street. What they didn't realize was that I had absolutely no intention of letting that happen. I stepped off the grass and onto the sidewalk right behind them. Not rushing. Not sneaking. Just calmly following. At first, they didn't notice. They were too busy whispering to each other. I caught bits and pieces of their conversation, muttered complaints about nosy neighbors and people who had nothing better to do. The shorter one even let out a small laugh, clearly convinced that the situation had already blown over. Then they reached the next house, Mr. Donnelly's place. The tall one stepped onto the walkway and lifted his hand to knock. That was when I spoke. "Remember," I said calmly from behind them, "if he says no, you leave." Both men froze, slowly. They turned around. The shorter one stared at me like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. I smiled pleasantly. "Nope." The tall one rubbed his temples like he suddenly had a headache. "Ma'am," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, "why are you following us?" I folded my arms and leaned slightly against the fence beside the walkway. "Because you told me to mind my own business," I replied. And this street is my business." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The irritation on their faces was slowly turning into something closer to disbelief. The shorter one scoffed. "You can't just follow us around?" "Sure I can," I said. "This is a public sidewalk." Then I pointed at the front door. "So, go ahead. Knock." They hesitated, clearly uncomfortable now. But pride is a powerful thing, especially for people who spend their days trying to control conversations. The tall one finally shrugged and knocked on the door. A few seconds later, Mr. Donnelly opened it just a crack. He was in his late 70s and always looked slightly confused whenever someone unexpected appeared at his door. The tall salesman immediately launched into his pitch. "Good afternoon, sir. We're working with homeowners in the neighborhood and offering—" Mr. Donnelly shook his head almost instantly. "No thanks." The tall salesman opened his mouth to continue speaking, and that's when I cleared my throat loudly behind him. Both salesmen froze again. I raised my eyebrows. "Well?" I said. The tall one clenched his jaw. The shorter one muttered something under his breath. Then, without another word, they turned and stepped away from the door. Mr. Donnelly blinked at the strange scene in front of him. "Everything all right?" he asked. I smiled up at him. Just making sure people respect the word no, Mr. Donnelly. He chuckled and closed the door. The two salesmen walked back to the sidewalk with stiff, irritated movements. This is ridiculous, the shorter one snapped. Is it? I replied calmly. Yes, it is. Well, I said, shrugging slightly. Then you should probably leave the street. The tall one pointed down the block. We still have houses to visit. I nodded. And I still have time. That sentence seemed to hit them harder than anything else I had said so far. They stared at me for a long moment, trying to decide if I was bluffing. I wasn't. Finally, the tall one shook his head in frustration and started walking again toward the next house. And just like I promised, I followed. By the time we reached the third house, something interesting started happening. Neighbors were noticing. On quiet streets like ours, unusual activity spreads attention quickly. Curtains shifted, front doors cracked open. A couple of people stepped out onto their porches pretending to water plants or check the mail. They were all watching, and what they saw was two increasingly irritated salesmen trying to knock on doors, while a woman followed them like a determined shadow. At the next house, the shorter salesman knocked while glaring back at me. The door opened. Before he could even begin his pitch, I spoke clearly from the sidewalk. Remember? I said loudly. If they say no, you leave. The homeowner laughed. Oh, that's easy, he said. No? The door closed. The salesman didn't even try to argue that time. They just turned and walked away again. But now the humiliation was starting to set. In every house, every knock, every no, and every time, I was there, watching, reminding them. By the fifth house, the tall one finally snapped. He spun around and pointed at me. Why are you doing this? I tilted my head slightly. Because you ignored someone when they told you no. That's not your job, I gestured down the entire street. These are my neighbors. The shorter one laughed bitterly. You think you own the street or something? I looked slowly from one house to the next. Then I pointed at them one by one. That one's Mr. Donnelly. I pointed to another. That's Mrs. Alvarez. Then another. And that's the Thompsons. Finally, I looked directly back at the salesman. They've all lived here longer than you've probably been alive. The tall one crossed his arms. So what? So, I said calmly, you don't get to come here and push them around. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I pointed toward the sidewalk leading off the street. You can leave any time. They didn't. Instead, they stubbornly continued down the block. And just like I promised earlier, I followed them to every single house. By now, several neighbors were openly watching the situation unfold. A couple of them were smiling. One of them even gave me a small thumbs up from across the street. The salesman's confident sales routine had completely collapsed. Every time they knocked on a door, they were tense and distracted, glancing back at me like they expected another lecture. And if they tried to keep talking after someone said no, they got one, a long one, about respect, about consent, about basic human decency. By the time we reached the last house at the end of the street, both of them looked exhausted. Their shoulders were slumped. Their earlier confidence had completely vanished. They stood on the sidewalk staring down the block they had just walked, realizing that the entire afternoon had been a complete disaster. The tall one turned to me with a glare. You happy now? I smiled. Very. And then I pointed toward the main road at the end of the street. You boys should probably find a different neighborhood. For a few seconds, they just stood there. Then, without another word, they walked away, and I watched them go. The two salesmen stood there for a few seconds after I pointed toward the end of the street. The main road was only about a block away, but suddenly it looked like a very long walk for them. A few minutes earlier, they had arrived with that confident swagger that door-to-door salesmen always seem to carry. Their shoulders had been straight, their smiles rehearsed, their voices loud and full of certainty. They had walked onto our quiet street like hunters entering a field they assumed would be easy territory. Now that confidence was completely gone, the tall one looked down the street again, almost like he was hoping the houses might suddenly disappear so he wouldn't have to walk past them all. The shorter one shifted uncomfortably and glanced back toward the neighbors who were still watching from porches and windows. Because by this point, almost the entire block knew something unusual had happened. Mrs. Alvarez had stepped out onto her porch with her arms folded, clearly enjoying the show. Mr. Donnelly was standing by his front window with the curtain pulled slightly aside. The Thompsons had come outside under the excuse of checking their mailbox, but they weren't even pretending anymore. They were just openly watching the two salesmen stand there awkwardly at the end of the street. Silence hung in the air for a moment. Then the tall salesman sighed. It was the sound of someone who had just realized the day wasn't going to go the way he planned. Without another word, he turned toward the main road. The shorter one followed him, and just like that, they left. I stood on the sidewalk and watched them walk away until they finally reached the corner and disappeared out of sight. The entire street seemed to relax the moment they were gone. The quiet afternoon returned almost instantly, like someone had pressed a reset button on the neighborhood. A moment later, I heard a soft voice behind me. Well, that was something. I turned around to see Mrs. Patterson slowly walking down her front walkway. She had a gentle smile on her face, but there was also a look of relief in her eyes. "Oh, honey," she said, shaking her head slightly. "You didn't have to do all that." I walked over and gave her a reassuring smile. "Actually," I said, "I kind of did." She laughed softly. "I kept telling them I wasn't interested." "I know," I replied. "I heard you." She patted my arm affectionately. "Well, I'm glad someone did." By then, a few other neighbors had started wandering closer, curiosity finally getting the better of them. Mr. Donnelly stepped off his porch and walked down his driveway with a big grin on his face. "Did you really follow those fellas down the entire street?" he asked. I shrugged. "Pretty much." He burst out laughing. "I wish I'd had popcorn." Mrs. Alvarez joined us a moment later, still smiling. "They deserved it," she said firmly. "Those men were here last year too. Wouldn't take no for an answer then either." That comment made me raise my eyebrows. "Seriously?" "Oh yes," she said. "They stood on my porch for nearly 10 minutes even after I told them I wasn't." "Interested?" Mr. Donnelly nodded in agreement. "They tried the same thing with me once before. Real pushy." That was the moment I realized something important. Those two men hadn't just picked the wrong street that afternoon. They had been doing this for a long time, walking into quiet neighborhoods, ignoring signs, ignoring polite refusals, counting on people to be too nice to push back. And for the first time in a long while, someone had actually pushed back. Mrs. Patterson squeezed my hand gently. "You know," she said with a warm smile, "my husband used to say this street looked out for its own." I glanced around at the neighbors gathered on the sidewalk. Think he was right. For the rest of the evening, the story spread up and down the block. By sunset, everyone seemed to know exactly what had happened. A few people joked that I had officially become the neighborhood security system. But the best part? Those salesmen never came back. Not the next week. Not the next month. Not even the next year. Word must have traveled somewhere along the line because, from that day forward, door-to-door salesmen suddenly seemed to avoid our street altogether. And every once in a while, when I take my trash cans down to the curb or help one of my neighbors with something small, I still think about that afternoon, about the moment those two men ignored the word no, and how they spent the rest of their day learning exactly why that word matters. Because sometimes protecting people doesn't require yelling or fighting. Sometimes it just means standing there, refusing to move, and making sure that when someone says no, everyone else hears it too. And honestly, even all these years later, Thinking about the look on their faces as they walked down that street still makes me smile.